First of all, it seems that the Accord doesn't get enough praise, I think, for its efforts and its commitments to see workers' rights enshrined in all sorts of different areas. It's something that hasn't really cropped up today. We focused on a lot of the economic aspects. But it seems to me one of the strengths of the Accord was that workers' rights in the face of technological change, organisational change, and many other areas too were enshrined in the Accord. I think, David, you might have referred briefly to sort of flirting with industrial democracy, and that was something that happened through that Accord period. We haven't really seen much of that since, which I think is a bit of a shame. But also, much of the discussion today has been as if we either have an Accord or we don't have an Accord. But surely there's an ongoing discussion, which is certainly seen at ACTU congresses, where the ACTU talks about the importance of having Labour in government and what it can do to keep Labour in government, and leaders of the ALP turn up to ACTU congresses and talk about their commitment to the policies that the ACTU is passing. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's not really as if it's either have an Accord or don't have an Accord, but it's what kind of beast you do have. And I think there's room to be a little bit more sophisticated in the agreements, whatever we call them.
Thank you, Ed. Now, some comments from the panel. Who would like to lead off? David, you've spoken about this, and you want to amplify?
Well, yes, there were great ambitions actually for promoting employee participation in industrial democracy, green paper in 1985 and all that stuff. And it went somewhere, but it didn't go all that far. And it's got even less far since. So yes, that's right. There were definitely improvements in workers' rights made since then, but there hasn't been much since. In the question of the sort of the halfway house, so to speak, of the links between the ALP and the ACTU that aren't in a signed accord, but they still continue. And there's certainly, you watch the media, you think, well, the government's just about the puppets of the unions because the ACTU or unions have got this many members coming along to conferences. I've got these many ex-presidents and secretaries in Parliament and as ministers and so on. And and so there's certainly the illusion of strong influence that unions have on the ALP. I'm not actually convinced that it is much more than an illusion. Like there's obviously some links that still happen. But really looking at the decisions of government over the last few years, I think the Fair Work Act, I was involved in the discussions over the Brereton legislation in 1994. And it's basically a working party between the government and the ACTU, and they basically designed the legislation. And this time around with the Fair Work Act, which has been the next major go legislation, well, there was a formal mechanism by which both businesses and separately unions were engaged, but really looking at the outcomes and looking at, okay, in which way after the law, after the election, given the outstanding issues that were unresolved in the Forward with Fairness policy, on which ones did employers win, on which ones did unions win? I'd say it's about 50-50. And I'd say that looking at the way the Fair Work Act reformed things, or indeed Forward with Fairness reformed things, purported to reform things, it's about 50-50. It's nowhere near a step back to the Brereton legislation or the Willis legislation before it. And certainly big changes in relation to AWAs and unfair dismissal that were major gains for unions, but in terms of the provisions regarding rights of access and industrial action and so on, it's still a long way from what existed beforehand. So you just don't see the same level of influence that the unions have upon the government as before, and it's probably less, I suspect it's probably less than maybe in the last half century or so, really, if not longer.
I don't disagree with anything David said, but I think an interesting thing that's occurred since the Accord, and I read that Bill actually alluded to this today, I don't know if he said it in his speech today, Bill Kelty, of course I'm talking about, is that the ACTU moved away from being the main mechanism by which all unions were brought along, if you like, with negotiations with the government and changes, and particularly in my time in the union movement, when I started with the nurses, we've seen now individual unions themselves running their own campaigns outside of the ACTU. They're doing their own issue-based lobbying. You go up to Canberra, you know, and I see all my union colleagues hanging out up there at Aussies, and you say, well, what are you doing here? What are you campaigning for? So it's not really centralised, and one of the things that I've certainly tried to do in my presidency is bring the union movement together again to do some very hard consolidating movement-wide campaigning, which is what we're trying to do with the insecure work and precarious work issue, and with, I think, some success. So it's about building up the ACTU again, I think, as a real peak body that has influence for the entire movement.
Oh, look, my comment is that I think David hit it on the head, that it's unions talk to government and they win sometimes, and business talks to government and they win sometimes, but it's not. That's because each is acting as a separate interest, pursuing their own interest, not as with a broader national interest at stake, and I think that's the issue. That's what the difference is, I think.
What role is there for business and unions to sort of moderate? What role can they play, or how can they better moderate those wage claims and force down some of the cost pressures, where we now have a situation where, for example, it costs on average about $30 per hour to dig coal out of the ground in the US, and about $90 an hour in Australia. Like, there are indisputably cost pressures for employers out there.
The first thing I have to say, and David said, there's no wages outbreak in Australia right now. There's not. And you know, there's no evidence to show that at all. The wages share of income is the lowest it's been of national income for decades, I think. And to try to say that there is wages outbreak and wages pressure is simply not correct. Wages have decoupled from productivity. They're going backwards now. Productivity is rising faster than wages. We see the biggest gap we're seeing in history between the minimum wage and the average wage. There's no wages outbreak. However, on an industry basis, what I'm saying today is that we should have a tripartite approach to all the pressures that are on this, manufacturing, whether it's coal, gas, whether it's LNG. We would very much appreciate a tripartite process to sit down and discuss, are there real pressures on the industry? Can they afford the wages? You know, and you know, we would welcome that. I said that, as I've said in my speech.
One of the things that struck me in the comments about industrial democracy was that there wasn't any formal organisation of that except through the three-tiered wage system. First tier being for 4% for being in the game, another 4% for consultation, and then of course 3% for super. And that process of consultation about the second 4%, the second tier, was very influential in establishing consultative mechanisms and ways in which there was a great deal of discussion about ways in which there could be significant improvement in productivity, workplace reform, etc., etc. So it seems to me that that's something that could well be recognised as being, there was a significant expansion of worker involvement in decision making in workplaces.
Yeah, well, what they call the two-tier wage system, you're right, there was productivity, superannuation, there's a separate tier going on. And yes, it did force discussions at the workplace level. It was really mainly focused about finding cost offsets for that 2%, but it did put in place some workplace discussion mechanisms that for the 2 years before them had been somewhat stymied by the centralised wage system. And then there's various aspects of the institutional arrangements in the wage system that sort of help push that along. I think in the Brereton legislation in '93, there was a little provision there that basically said that there had to be some mention in the EBA of whether there was going to be a consultation arrangement in place and what that would be, but that was removed in 1997. So there were these things in the I think the Commission in its October 91 decision put in some provisions about consultation. Is that right, Keith? I don't remember either. But anyway, yeah, so there were a few things along those lines. Nothing massive, but a few sort of series of incremental things that all pushed along that direction a little bit and then were wound back in the subsequent Workplace Relations Act.
Jeff Robinson from Deakin University. Just perhaps in terms of the run-up to the election of current Labor government, there was a lot of discussion in the early noughties of proposals for works councils in Australia, and there were a few conferences about it, I think, and even a book produced on it. But nothing really seemed to come up that agenda at all after the election of the Labor government. I was wondering if anybody could shed any light on what happened there.
Just on where it went and what happened, it really never got legs. It was, I know Greg Combay was a big fan of it, and it was often discussed from my memory at executive, but it was not something that was generally supported by the unions, and for lots of reasons that people in this room could probably explain better than me, probably you yourself could. But you know, certainly I think it's something that's worth considering, and you know, maybe we can have a rational discussion about it. It certainly did disappear, I agree, and it wasn't very popular with the union movement here.
It's Greg Combay's thing at one time. It still is. He still talks about it as, and maybe had you been given a different ministry, it might have gone further.
In the 80s, of course, the idea was getting around quite a bit in the 70s, but unions were actually very opposed to it because they saw works councils as being an alternative source of power, alternative focus of power to themselves, and they didn't want any alternatives being feasible. So, and that was one of the things that didn't really help along the Green Paper and all that stuff. And it's a little bit unfortunate in the sense that in Germany, where you've got institutionalised works councils, the works councils, wherever you've got a unionised workplace, it's basically union delegates or whatever that dominate the works councils anyway. So they don't, in Germany, they don't really supplant unions so much as supplement and reinforce them. But I think there was a bit of a change in union approach to them in the 90s, probably with Greg and so on, but you know, not enough.
If we're looking at the future and we're looking at lessons and legacies, clearly it was an intervention, it was an attempt to address what was happening at that time and the issues of that time. Underpinning it, and I'm glad you've raised the Australia Reconstructed as a context for what happened, because I think that's important in terms of why people like Laurie Carmichael and others, they didn't see it principally as a vehicle for wage restraint. They saw it as a vehicle for some collective or co-determination of the economic future of the country. That's the way they saw it, and that's why they backed it in. That, I think, that part of it, I think it's still worth considering. To what extent is my question? To what extent do you think there is an appetite from the business community, and I guess I'm asking to our business representatives here more so, to what extent is there an appetite from the business community to actually share some of that role in determining the economic future of this country with the union movement? That is, I think, probably more pertinent given the lessons of the Accord, of the pitfalls of a two-legged stool, which is what I think led to the downfall or some of the negative aspects of the Accord.
Well, I think I think that the people that I represent and most business organisations would say, yeah, sure, that's a great idea. It's got to be led by government, I think, because it's a policy thing, really. It's not. I mean, business doesn't shape the economic outcome any more than unions shape the economic outcome. In a conscious way. That's markets sort of take business and everyone else with them, of course. But policy is the intervention. So it's got to be led by government. Now, I'm not very confident about beyond September this year about a union business government dialogue. I don't know. You might have other thoughts, Jeff, but I just can't see. The body language isn't right just yet.
My question to Dr. Byrne What's the one key example of overreach in the current Workplace Relations Act that you think undermines common purpose? And what process do you think should be adopted to break the cycle of overreach in future IR law reform?
Well, I mean, the political process is going to determine where the law turns out, and people will, the pull and push of different interest groups and the discussion and the debate that occurs is what will determine the outcomes.
But isn't that the problem?
Well, it's just a fact. And
no, other countries don't have that problem.
Oh, well, it's our fact then. I'm not our IR guru, but there are powers that may happen and may be introduced, have been discussed in relation to compulsory arbitration that we don't think are a great idea. That's something that can be debated, but the details probably, I'm not the best person to do it. There are elements of the Fair Work Review that we think are great ideas that haven't been acted on, and that were recommended by the review as improvements that haven't been done. So that's sort of, I don't know if they're a fair umpire or what, but there's a benchmark. But another benchmark is that here we have a very, very wary political leader of the coalition who can stand up and say, basically, I'm not going to do any IR reform. I'm too worried. But can still identify 3 things that he's going to do and say, well, I'm not going to get any controversy out of them. So to me, that says something about where there might be some areas of overreach.